Well, welcome back, folks. Today we're going to continue on with working on replacing the fluid in this one shock that had no rebound or dampening or much fluid left in it at all, if you recall from the previous video. This has been sitting for about 48 hours, so I have not done anything with it outside of about 24 hours ago. I stood the unit on end like this, and the reason being is I wanted the fluid to contact the seal here. I want to make sure I had good full contact with the seal to help that swell and to recondition it. Also, what I did a day or two ago is I took one of the other spare shocks and I cut it apart. I cut the cylinder apart here, and to see what was inside, I was curious what the internals of these shocks look like. And I wanted to do some measuring to determine the volume. I'm not going to go through the detail on that shock that I cut apart right now in this video. I will cover that in quite a bit more detail at the end of this video, and you will see right below me right now a little message that will tell you at what point in the video you can jump to if you wish to see me go through that detail on cutting that shock in half. For this video though, we're going to drain the fluid, and then I'm going to replace approximately 50% of the volume of this cylinder with a fork oil. Replace this set screw and sealing it with some Permatex thread sealant, which is actually designed for pressure and situations or configurations such as this. This thread sealant I have had around for about 5 years. It was left over from a project when I helped my brother rebuild his small block 302 Ford here in my shop a number of years ago, and he was putting in a hot rod, so he brought it over here, and he actually had bought this and left it behind so that I could have it. So it's perfect for this application. So what we're going to do first is just remove this set screw. And again, I have not been in here since we put this together a couple of days ago. I'm going to remove the set screw, and now we're just going to drain that fluid out. I'm pushing on the piston, as you can see. Now, I'm not concerned about getting all of this fluid out. In fact, I'm perfectly okay with some of it remaining inside of that cylinder to act as a treatment for that seal at this end. There is a seal down here that we'll talk about later on. And I'm perfectly fine with some of that fluid remaining in that cylinder. You can see the fluid right there. Came out fairly clean. Got a little color to it, but nothing serious, I don't think. Based on my calculations of the internal volume of the cylinder, which is about 12.21 milliliters, or cc's. A cc, cubic centimeter, and a milliliter are the same, by the way. But since my syringe is calibrated in milliliters that I'm going to use to replace the fluid, I'm just going to replace half of it, which is about 6 milliliters or 6 cc's. I'm going to put into the cylinder cavity. There's no real reason I chose 6 or 50% of the volume, only because it seemed logical, and based on cutting apart the cylinder a day or so ago. I didn't measure the fluid that came out of it because I'm not sure it was all there to begin with, but I'm estimating about 50% of this cavity has had originally fluid in it. It really doesn't make any difference in this case, because I could always change it. I could take the plug back out and I could replace it or remove some of it, or I could add more to make up the difference, but I'm not terribly concerned about it. No matter what I do, I think it's going to be an improvement from where it was at, which is it had no fluid in it to speak of at all. Oop, and a little bit more. A little fluid in there. So now we're going to go ahead and replace the missing fork oil. Let me get set up for that here in a second, and we'll go ahead and get that done. This is my fork oil of choice. I've used Bellray products for a long time. I've always been very happy with the service I've received from Bellray products. I prefer to use a lightweight oil. This is a 10 weight or 10W oil. You can get 15W, you might even be able to get a 20, but I've always just bought 10 weight, which is quite thin. The oil, by the way, that came out of the original shock that I cut apart was very, very thin. It was almost like water. And I use specifically fork oil rather than motor oil just because it's purpose made for motorcycle shocks. I have loaded my syringe with approximately 6 milliliters of the Bellray product, which is again approximately 50% of the volume of the cylinder. I make sure the piston is retracted all the way, and I'm just going to go ahead now and add the fluid to the shock body real slowly. If you can see that right there or not. Now we've got the fluid in the cylinder. I'm tilted up just because I don't want any of it running out. I'm going to gently clean the internal threads here. Zoom in for you a little bit. Reposition. I'm going to gently clean the internal threads. I'll take a piece of clean paper towel, twist it into a point, put a little brake cleaner on it, and then I'm going to just gently swab inside of that hole, clean the threads, and then I will do the same for the cap screw plug before I go ahead and put the Permatex on it, and I'll do that off camera. I've got the internal threads cleaned, gently cleaned, and I have the threads on the cap screw also clean and dry. The thread sealant, and this is a sealant by the way, it's not a Loctite. It's designed to prevent, well, it'll lock, but it's really designed to prevent leakage of like water jackets in automobiles, hydraulic fittings, and those kind of things. And it's really an ideal product for this situation because I'm more concerned about leakage of the fluid out of the hole than I am with locking the screw in place. I could use thread locker for that, but this really has that dual purpose. The fact that it's high temperature is irrelevant for our purposes. I have kneaded this tube like that, which you should also do, by the way, if you have thread locker that has sat for any length of time. Knead the tube a bit to make sure that the product hasn't separated in there from sitting. So now we're going to just take and put a little thread locker on the threads here. If I can get this in focus for you. You don't need to use a ton of this stuff. If I can get it to come out. There we go. You don't need to overdo it. I'm going to go about 3/4 or so of the way around. And it will spread itself when it's threaded into the fitting. Like that. So there I think you can see, I'll smear right there. I think you can see the thread locker and about how far in I put that plug. It's just a cap screw is all it is. So now I'm just going to let that sit. I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm going to let the thread locker do its thing, and I'm going to allow this part just to sit. What we're going to move on to now is I'm going to reassemble the second shock. That'd be this one. I'm going to reassemble this one, that is, put it back together with the spring and all the hardware. You can see here the parts. Let me pull this out a little broader for you. These are all the various parts for assembling the shock, both of these shocks. I have a few extras because of the shock that I took apart. I threw those in here as well. These have been polished in a tumbler. None of these, fortunately, were rusty, believe it or not. They had tarnish on them, and they had grease and oil on them, but they had no rust like you would expect to see. So they're in very good condition. So I cleaned them up briefly on a wire wheel, and then I threw them in the tumbler with the walnut shells for about 36 hours or so, and just polished them up nice and clean, as you can see there. So I'm going to sort these parts out. Like I said, I have an extra set because I took that one shock apart, and pick the best of the three, and we're going to move on to reassembling this shock. Around 20 minutes or so later, and I've completed the initial setup for compressing this spring. Let me take you through the details. Two different ratcheting straps. One end of the long end, the loose end, I hooked over a long bolt that I put through the bottom of the shock, like you can see here. And it's hooked over that big bolt. On the bolt, I have washers, and then the head of the bolt on this side and nuts on this side. That's just to prevent this from popping off the end. So this end's hooked. I brought it around, looped it through towards the top of the shock spring, like you can see here. Looped it through and brought it back, and through the ratcheting mechanism on the ratchet itself. On the opposite end of this ratchet strap, you have to create a pulling point or a fulcrum. So what I did also on that bolt, I wrapped that other end around several times. That's the end that comes off of here. Brought the eyelets on each side out and just put this screwdriver through it to act as a fulcrum to pull against. And then I just tightened everything up like you can see here. So this is really now ready to pull. One other point is I try to keep the plastic covered hooks between the metal ratchet and the chrome spring for obvious reasons, as I don't want to mar the new chrome. So this will protect each of these plastic covered hooks, as well as the fabric of the strap itself will protect the chrome from being scratched from the ratchet itself. On the bottom of the shock right here, the way this is arranged is it'll go, let me get a different piece here for you. This is the bottom of the shock. The way this is arranged is this piece goes down like that, and then this one goes over the top of it like that. And that's what's at the bottom of the shock. Now, Yamaha apparently made an engineering change because the other two shocks that I bought, one of which I sacrificed here, has this piece right here molded in or formed into the bottom of the shock. So there is a difference in shocks. My original shocks had a two-piece plate arrangement on the bottom like you can see here, and that's what I duplicated there. So now I think I'm ready to go. So it's just a matter of starting to ratchet these individual ratchets down, and what I will do is I'll do them one at a time. So just watch what happens as I start to tighten these. Let me get these parts out of the way. These are the parts, by the way, here, right here, that will go on the top of the shock when I'm ready to go. So I will tighten them both individually, trying to keep my head out of your way here as I go. And I'm pulling this spring down that way as I go. And you can see the bolt end, or the threaded end of the shaft. The piston shaft is starting to become exposed. How far down you go is really up to you. What you want to do is just get enough comfortable working distance there that you can put these pieces on. And I think I'm pretty close there. So I'm going to go ahead now and assemble the top of the shock. I don't want to forget my rubber bumper, which goes in there over the shaft like that. Then what will happen is I will take this nut, washer, and then the top eyelet and thread them on to this bolt. Now I'm going to put just a little dab of blue Loctite on the threads here. I said a little, came gushing out all over. Then this nut, the squared off nut, gets threaded on next. Then the plate. Then the top of the shock. Now when you position this, it really doesn't make any difference where you position your eyelet because you can turn this, as you can see. So I'm just going to snug that up. Let me get a wrench. And I'm only going to snug it. I'm not going to over tighten it. It's not necessary to over tighten that. If you ever wanted to get it apart, I'll be glad you didn't over tighten it. So now it's just a matter of releasing these ratchet straps and allowing the shock to return to its full depth. And you can see now all the tension is off the spring. So this shock assembly is basically complete. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to go ahead and finish releasing these ratchet straps. Again, you can see that they're loose. And I'll bring you back here after I've got this all disassembled. That's going to take a couple. And there's our first rear shock complete back together with the new chrome. You will notice I put one of the rubber bushings back in. This is one of the originals. When I put that bolt through there to act as a fulcrum, just to protect the inside of that aluminum, because that is soft metal. So I just put one of the old bushings back in. Other than that, there's not much else to say except that one's now done and ready to go back on the bike. This is the one a short time ago I refilled with fluid shock oil, if you recall. I'm going to let that sealant right there sit for 24 hours. I went online and checked to see what the cure time is on that, and Permatex recommends 24 hours. So I'm going to let this shock set for 24 hours, and then I'll come back and we'll put this one back together as well, and then I'll have the pair complete. It's 24 hours later, and I've allowed the sealant here to set. I tilted it with the left end up and the cylinder pointing down this way because I wanted the oil to rest against the seal on this end. And that is one piece of good news, is that seal right here, and there is a seal in there, is not leaking with that thin fork oil. So that's a piece of good news. I did wipe off that little ring of white sealant there. It was pretty much cured, but I did wipe it off. And we're going to see what's going to happen here. I'm going to push down on the piston and see if we get oil weeping out of this hole. I'm not sure this is going to work, but let's see what happens here. So you can watch along with me. So I'm just going to push that piston down. Yeah, and you can see it's weeping right there. So it didn't seal. The good news is I've got the action back in the cylinder. In other words, both compression and damping seem to be working pretty good. But it leaks, and that was one thing I was concerned about. So I have a couple options here. One is take the plug out, drain the fluid out of the cylinder, and we're really back where we started, and just go ahead and assemble it and call it good. This was an experiment after all. The other option, or another option, would be to pull the plug, drain the fluid, and replace it with something heavier and reseal this plug with a different sealant. Now, if you recall, yesterday I used a thread sealant for this. So I think what I'm going to do now, since I'm not in a rush, I think I'm going to pull the plug, drain the fluid, clean it out good, and put a different fluid, something a little bit heavier in there, a little thicker. And I think instead of using the thread sealant, I think I'm going to use just Loctite, probably blue Loctite on this. The primary reason is blue Loctite sits up within a matter of a few hours rather than having to let it sit another 24. And I'll give that a shot and see if that helps. So drain it, heavier fluid, blue Loctite instead of thread sealant, see if that works. If it doesn't, that fails, and what I will probably do is I'll just drain the fluid, leave it dry, maybe just leave a little bit here in the bottom. So just enough so it doesn't leak, and leave the fluid out of it and move on, because I'm just back where I really started from. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'll bring you back after I've made that change, and we'll see if it leaks then. It's been a couple hours now. What I did, as I indicated previous, I emptied the cylinder, pulled the plug, emptied the cylinder, flushed it, and what I refilled it with is a little bit less of this oil right here. Actually, it's just transmission oil. It's 80W. Don't let that 80W throw you. It's still quite thin. It's thicker than the fork oil I put in previous, which was a green color, but it's still relatively thin. It does have a little bit more body. I put in about 4 ounces, or 4 milliliters rather, of the transmission oil rather than 6 milliliters of the fork oil. And again, good news is that the seal there is not leaking. Used Loctite this time, blue Loctite, so that I can get that out of fairly easily if I need to, rather than the red permanent type of Loctite. It requires heat. So I've let it set for a few hours now to allow the Loctite to do its thing. So let's see now together if this is going to leak as I push on that cylinder. And it seems to be tight. And it does have damping in both directions on this piston. I can tell by the feel of it that it does have compression and rebound damping. Obviously I can't measure that for you, only share what it feels like. You'll have to take my word for it. So I'm going to consider that, believe it or not, a success. I am a little surprised that the Loctite worked better than the thread sealant, which was really made for this application, frankly. But so I don't know if it's the compound that I used, a little thicker oil, a little less oil. I don't really know, but it does seem to be fluid tight, so I'm going to consider that a success. And I think I have managed to, at least to some degree, have rescued this and restored this shock to its normal operation. Actually, it feels pretty good. So now that we've got that step out of the way, what I'm going to do now is reassemble the shock. I'm not going to show the whole thing, but what I am going to do, I thought, I'm going to put this together as I did in the previous shock, but I'm going to show a little more detail of how I secured the end of the this end of the shock here with a ratchet strap, so you can see the process I used to make sure that everything stayed together. Now we're going to go ahead and do the final assembly of the second of the two rear shocks. This is the one where I experimented with replacing the fluid that had somewhere along the way and went away, which was successful, by the way. My little experiment, I've never done that before. However, I did have a little wrinkle in the process. One of the things that I discovered as I was preparing to and thinking through the process of reassembling this shock is that I had left off this bottom hardware that you see here that I had talked about in the previous video. Well, that hardware, those washers, those plates would not fit down over that cap screw that I use as a plug, where I filled this cylinder with approximately 4 milliliters of fluid. So I had two options. I could either notch these plates to fit over the cap screw or remove the plug, put the plates on, then reseal the plug. So I chose that second option rather than modifying these plates. Well, that didn't work out so well. What happened is I couldn't get this plug to reseal using Loctite like I did the first time. And it must have been an anomaly, and I must have had everything just right. Because when I tried to reseal it, and I redid it, I think 3 different times using Loctite, exactly like I did that first time, I couldn't get this to seal. It would always weep when I pushed in on this piston. So it's actually a couple of days later now. What I decided to do is use, or attempt to use, epoxy. So I used a 2-part epoxy and epoxied that cap screw in place. So I put the plates on, mixed up some 2-part epoxy, and used the epoxy as the sealant and the adhesive. And it seemed to work fine because there's no leakage whatsoever. And there is compression and rebound dampening now on that cylinder. There's, again, 4 milliliters or so of, I think ultimately what I ended up using was 80-weight transmission fluid. And that seems to have nice action. I have to put a little pressure on it to make it work. And then I just touch it up with some silver paint. Not absolutely necessary because you'll never see it when the spring is over the outside and it's on the inside of the bike. But I thought just to finish off the detail, I would touch it up with silver paint, and I let it dry for 24 hours. So that's good and dry. These rubber bands are only used to hold these plates and keep them out of the way while I was working on this cap screw and painting it and touching up, etc. But I think I was successful. I've got, again, there's not a ton of damping or rebound, but there is much more than there was before. And you can hear it working in there. And there's no leakage here at the seal either, so we'll consider that a success. So for future reference, it can be done. I'm going to go ahead and assemble this. I'm not going to show everything I showed on the previous video when I did the first shock because it would be redundant. But what I am going to show is how I configured here at the bottom with the anchor point through, if you recall. I believe I probably could show a little more detail about that. So I'm going to go ahead and set up now to install this shock spring, and I'll slow down a bit when I get to the point of how I anchor this at this end so that the ratchet straps had something to pull against. So I'll set up and I'll bring you back. I thought I'd take a moment here to explain a little bit more detail how I have this ratcheting system set up to compress these springs. On the right, here and here, are the loose end of the ratchet strap mechanism. In other words, these are not attached permanently to the ratchet mechanism. The other end of each one of these are these two hooks here. They loop down through the ratchet mechanism here, back up through the spring, and then ultimately terminate by hooking over the anchor bolt that I put through the bottom of the shock eye right here. I also positioned these hooks and the strap against the chrome of the shock to protect the shock, the chrome, from the metal of the ratchet straps. The other end of the ratcheting mechanism, which comes off of these 2 points here, simply wrap around that anchor bolt several times. Actually, they go around the other way, and then they end up coming right out here. So these hooks right here are permanently attached here and here. And then I simply just put this screwdriver through so that when I ratchet, these don't want to tend to pull through or unwrap and unravel and pull through. That's the way I've got it rigged. Now, in order to pull the spring, I just start equally ratcheting down on these ratchet mechanisms, and I'll start pulling that spring down. And there basically we have the shock reassembled. I'll have to go ahead and obviously remove this some of this hardware, but the spring is back together. I didn't forget the bumper on the inside, and we'll consider this shock done. Otherwise, I think we're going to call this a wrap. I'm going to go ahead and put these shocks on the bike in a separate video, temporarily using these cap screws and likely this hardware, these bushings. But we'll do that in another video, as this one will be long enough. Any issues or questions, drop me a note. Otherwise, as usual, thanks for watching. I thought for those of you that are interested, I would share with you what I discovered when I cut one of my spare shocks apart. The original reason I cut it apart is I wanted to get this rubber bumper out, which I seem to have misplaced from my original pair of shocks. So I just cut this shaft off in my bandsaw, and that cut very easily. That's not a very hard steel. But since I had it apart anyway and it was now not usable, obviously, I thought I would just go ahead and cut the cylinder and see what was inside. This particular shock still had quite a bit of oil in it, and I would estimate probably a third to a half of this cylinder had oil, very thin, foul-smelling brew. I clamped it in my vise and just took a Dremel cut-off blade and went around it, and it opened right up. The piston, I guess that's what we'll call that. Let me get it out here for you. Looks like that. You see a series of holes, then a hole down the middle, which actually exits right there. So really it's a very simple form of valving. as you compress the piston against the fluid or the oil, it gets forced through this little opening right here, and it exits through the middle of the shaft right here. And that acts as the valving that controls the compression and damping. These little holes around the edge here, I'm really not sure what those are for. I don't know where they go. They don't seem to exit here. I don't know if they're just a space for expansion of the fluid that can flow into, rather. Fluid doesn't expand. Hydraulic oil or oil doesn't expand. It's not compressible. But maybe that's just a relief cavity. I really don't know. But that's what it looks like. And you can see, probably because it had oil in it all these years, it survived quite well. And then the cylinder, it sits like this. So in my left hand is the bottom. This is the top. The seal right there is intact. Now this seal actually is quite long. I suspect, and you probably can't see looking down in there, but this is a little cartridge, I think, that this seal sits in. It's probably about that long. And I believe it's pressed in at the factory. And then the top lip here is swedged over like this, so you can see how it's tapered. So I think that's really a cartridge that seal sits in. It's not just a round seal. Get a little more light for you here if I can find my flashlight. I don't know if you can see that or not. It's quite a long seal. It seems to be ribbed. It has ribs that go around as it goes down in. And anyway, that one was intact and didn't seem to be leaking. And evidence of that is the fact that there was still a lot of fluid in the cylinder. So that's really the design of that simple little arrangement. To calculate the fluid needed for the cylinder on the other shock that I've been working on, what I did is I measured both of the internal, the diameter and the depth of both of these tubes with a caliper, and then I calculated the volume of the cylinder using simple geometry, and then I had to, of course, remove from that calculation the space that the shaft, the piston, and the nut consumes, because they do consume space. So I measured those separately and did the math, subtracted the volume of the rod, piston, and nut from the total of the internals of the cylinder, and then I ended up with a net capacity volume of the total cylinder, and then I simply divided that number in two to use the figure of half the volume of the cylinder for the volume of the fluid. I was a little rusty on my geometry. It's been many, many years since I've used geometry, and I thought I knew the formula to figure volume of a cylinder. I was pretty close. It's pi squared, it's pi times diameter or radius squared times depth. So in other words, depth would be, I believe, this distance. I'm just reciting from memory, so forgive me if I get this wrong. Length of the cylinder or depth, radius squared times pi, I believe is the formula. And I was pretty close when I guessed at it. I forgot the squaring of the radius of the cylinder. Nonetheless, that's how I calculated the volume of the cylinder to come up with the volume of oil needed to fill in the other shock I'm working on. So thought folks might be interested in this. I'd never seen the inside of a rear motorcycle shock before. I'm sure modern shocks are much more complicated and have more involved valving, but then I've never cut another shock apart, so I wouldn't know. So I hope you found that interesting.